Hey friends, welcome back to Acre Homestead. My name is Becky. If you're new, canning season is not just a summer and fall thing, it is a year-round thing. And I have quite a few canning projects I need to get to this winter. But the first one that we are going to be doing today is we are going to be making some beef bone broth, and we are going to be getting that canned up in the pressure canner. I also need to pressure can up some black beans that I grew in my garden, and they're sitting in the pantry, and if they're not in the can, I'm not as likely to use it because canned beans are way more convenient than dried beans. So the first thing we are going to do is we are going to get these bones roasted. When you make beef bone broth, it's a little bit different. You actually want to roast your bones first so that you get a good caramelized coating on your beef bones, and you're going to get a much more depth of flavor, rich flavor in your bone broth. I have my roaster pan here and my beef bones. These are soup bones. I buy half a cow at a time from a local rancher. And when you do that, you can request beef bones. And if you don't request them, then they just get tossed. And when you're spending money on buying half a cow or a quarter cow, you want to make sure you get your money's worth. And this is great, nutrient-dense broth that we are going to be making, and you certainly wouldn't want to waste it. Now, these bones do have quite a bit of meat on them. We're not going to can the meat. I'm going to use that meat, and I'm going to make stroganoff with that. I'm going to put these in a single layer in my roaster pan, or as much as I can fit in here. When you order half a cow, this is the best way to get the most value out of it. Bone broth is extremely expensive at the grocery store. It's super easy to make. Mostly it just takes a little bit of time. Honestly, there's not much effort on our part when it comes to making bone broth. I only have 3 cans of turkey broth left in my pantry, which is not enough broth for me. I try not to buy store-bought broth if I can help it, so this is great timing to get this done. If you are a little bit intimidated about starting to pressure can, if you've never done it, can I recommend go out and get yourself a pressure canner and just try. You could always start with just canning water if you want, just to kind of get something under your belt. I wanted to try pressure canning for years. I wanted to do pressure canned beans and broth. Those were the 2 things that I was the most excited about or wanting to do. And I put it off. And I put it off for 4 years, which is crazy because making your own broth is how you can save yourself a ton of money. And you can control the ingredients. And you're gonna get a better quality product when you go to cook. Everything you cook with your homemade broth is just gonna taste so much better. We have our meat in our roaster pan. I'm gonna take a little bit of olive oil and sprinkle it on the top. This is just gonna help the browning process. If I had tomato paste, I would put it on here as well to help with the caramelization, but I don't, so we're gonna skip that step. What we're trying to do is we are trying to have the Maillard reaction happen. I have the oven set at 425 degrees. The Maillard reaction is when you get that brown caramelized color, that's the Maillard reaction. And I don't exactly know the whole chemistry behind it, but I know that that turns those carbohydrates and proteins into umami. That's the really savory, delicious, just like give you a hug type feeling. And that is why we are taking the time to do this step. You do not have to do this step when you're making broth. I could just take these bones, put them in a pot of water, boil them with some aromatics, and go from there. But we are not going to get as depth of a flavor. We're not going to get that really rich, silky, umami, savory broth if we skip this step. So that is why we are taking the time to do this step. So when this is done, this is probably going to take a good 45 minutes to an hour or so. I'll let you know exactly how long it takes in my oven. These bones are still a little bit frozen, so it might take a little bit longer. We'll come back to the next step. So a couple of these are ready to be turned because they're closer to the heating element. So this one here, I'm going to flip it over. The fire alarm's already gone off twice, so it's probably gonna go off again. I flipped every one of these. That's exactly what we want. Beautiful. Let me show you up close. You don't want it just the color brown, you want it actually browned like that. You see how there's caramelization on there? That's exactly what you want. That right there is perfect. That's what we want. So let's get this in the roaster pan. have our roasted bones. I'm gonna put them in this 22-quart Oster pan. This is my favorite way to make bone broth because I can make a lot of it at one time. And we're gonna get these bones right in here. I'm gonna link everything you need along with written directions on how to make this down in the description box. So if you wanna try to make this at home, then you'll be able to do that. If we're gonna make it, we might as well make a lot of it so I don't have to do it as often. That's kind of my philosophy on this type of stuff. Now what we need to do is flavor this with some aromatics. Typically, when I make bone broth, what I do is I use my vegetable scraps. I keep a Ziploc bag in my freezer, and anytime I peel carrots or I have celery ends, onion peels, anything like that, I put them in the freezer and then I put them in the roaster to make bone broth with them. But right now I don't have a ton of them, so I did also cut up 2 red onions. These are onions I purchased from a local farmer this August, and they're still good. But I want to go through these ones first because I just bought another bulk order of white onions, and these ones need to be used up first. These will also give this broth a nice dark color. So we're going to put 2 onions in here. And then right here, I have some elephant garlic that I grew last year. We have 2 of those big cloves we're going to stick in. And then I also have just some garlic. This was my leftover seed garlic that I didn't plant. And this needs to be used up before my whole heads of garlic because these will go bad faster. I'm not going to peel them. I'm not going to do anything. I'm going to just sprinkle them right in here. Now we're going to take our veggie scraps and we're going to put those in here as well. Now, I did not put all the bones in here because this roaster, if I put all the bones, I'm not going to end up with that much broth. I think I had more bones than can fit in the roaster. So what we're going to do is I left the smallest bones in this roaster pan, and we are going to make broth in the oven as well. I do this all the time. I'll show you how I do it. So if you don't have a big roaster like this, but you have a turkey roaster, you can make it in the oven. If you don't want to make this quantity like I'm doing, you could do it in your crock pot, or you could do it on a big pot on your stove. You don't have to do this big quantity like I do. I tend to go big or go home. A few of you guys have mentioned that in the comments. And the reason I do that is because I don't want to have to do this all the time. I'd rather do one big batch and then I can have it for 6 months, a year, something like that. So I need to put the same vegetables in here and then we'll put this in the oven and I'll show you how to do that when we get to it. But I just added some frozen celery to this roaster pan and garlic. I added my onions in there. Because I didn't have very many carrot peels, I have these itty bitty carrots from the garden that I saved. They've been in my refrigerator since July. The way that I preserve my carrots is I really don't have a desire to can carrots because I don't like really mushy carrots. So I take them out of the garden, I rinse them off with a hose really, really well. I line a Ziploc bag with a dry dish towel and then I put my carrots in there and they stay nice and, you hear that? Crunchy since July. I mean 5 to 6 months, no problem. So we're going to take these little carrots. You don't want to waste those little carrots, and we're going to use those as our flavoring. This is a good time to start using them though, because they are showing some signs of sprouting, and I was going to pickle them, but I never got around to it. So this is the perfect application for them. I have a bunch more in there, so maybe we will get to pickling them. So we have our carrots. I am going to season my broth. Some people like to season their broth later, but I feel more comfortable seasoning it now. I'm using my Redmond real salt. I have a discount for this Redmond real salt. It's mined in Utah, and if you want that, it will be linked down in the description box. Now we're going to add some whole peppercorns. I happen to have a tricolor pepper here. That's what we're going to use because that's all I have. Lots of pepper. And the last thing we're going to add are some bay leaves. I think bay leaves are the next thing that I'm going to add to my garden this year, because they grow in our area really well. So probably 5 or 6 in each one. Now all we have to do is fill this with water. I just looked up the Maillard reaction so I can give you the scientific reasoning behind it. The Maillard reaction is named after Mr. Maillard, a chemist who discovered this reaction. It is a chemical reaction between amino acids and reducing sugars that gives browned food its distinct flavor. Seared steak, fried dumplings, cookies, and other kinds of biscuits, breads, toasted marshmallows, and many other foods undergo this reaction. And that's what gives you a burst of umami. So that is why we're doing it. That is why we took that extra step, so that we can have the best flavored bone broth. If we're gonna go through all this work, we might as well have the best product possible. The last thing we're gonna add is just a little bit of red wine. This is an acid that's gonna help break down the collagen and minerals that are in those bones. You can also use apple cider vinegar or a vinegar if you want, if you don't want to use red wine in your cooking. I like to use red wine because it increases the flavor and it does the reaction of breaking down the minerals and collagen in the bones that we want, that is going to give us a really, really healthy bone broth. For this one, it is done. I'm going to put the lid on it, and we are going to let this sit at 200, 250 or so for 24 to 38 hours. We're going to be skiing tomorrow, so if I get home and I decide after we're skiing I want to can this up, we're going to do that. If I get home and I'm tired, I'll let it go one more night. So it just depends on how I'm feeling, whether this is going to go for 24 hours or 36 to 48 hours. We'll just see. Let's see if I can do this without spilling. Oh, it's heavy. Perfect. I wrap that with foil because I don't want that to evaporate. I want the liquid to stay in there because we're making broth. So I have my oven set for 250 degrees. My oven will only go for 12 hours at a time, so I have to, before I go to bed, it is 12:20 right now, but before I go to bed, I'll turn my oven off and I'll turn it back on at 250 degrees so that it stays going all night long. Before we go skiing, I'll do the same thing. I'll turn it off and turn it back on. And that is how you can make broth in the oven. You can do this with chicken. So I will see you guys back after quite some time when this broth is ready to strain. We're gonna pick the meat off and do the next step. It has been 36 hours. I definitely got home after skiing and was not in the mood to can up and strain this broth. So it is the next morning, and what I'm doing is I'm taking out the bones and I'm putting the bones in one bowl so that they can start to cool so I can pick the meat off the bones. My dogs were very intently right at my feet because I am pretty notorious for dropping things, and they tend to get a lot of goodies when I'm in the kitchen, so that's why they are hanging out with me. We have a busy day today, so this is pretty early in the morning, and I want to get this broth strained so that it can sit outside. It was pretty cold on this day. It was about 34 degrees, so I wanted this broth to be outside so that it could cool and the fat could solidify. And that is the goal, so that when we go to can up the broth, we can separate the fat from the beautiful broth in and of itself. I had this beef broth outside. It was about 40 degrees today, and what that did is it just helped solidify some of this fat on the top, so we can easily remove it because we don't want to can all of this beef fat, but we are going to save it. We're not going to get rid of this fat. This is called tallow, and because I used bones from a grass-fed, grass-finished beef, this is high quality fat, and we can use this to cook with. Well, that just made a mess. Let's see if I can do this without making a huge mess. You can probably hear my wood stove in the background. It's crackling. If there's a little bit of fat when you're canning, that's okay, but you do want to get the majority of this off there. This is how much meat we got off all of those bones. So there was a lot of meat on there. And this is going to make the best stroganoff. Traditionally, stroganoff is made with a braised beef, and basically that's what we did. We made braised beef as opposed to using ground beef. Stroganoff with ground beef is really good too, but this is a little bit more traditional. Now all we're gonna do is take our broth and put it in our jars. I like to can my broth in quarts. My canner holds 7 quarts at one time, so we're gonna start by filling 7 quarts. One thing to note, if you are making your broth in this roaster pan and you put it somewhere cool to cool down so the fat will separate like it did in the last one, don't put it in the actual roaster part outside too. I did that and this never got cold enough to harden the fat. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take just a measuring spoon and I'm gonna skim off as much of the fat by, you can see all that fat in there. And before I pour it into my jars, I am gonna put it in a fat separator. The cool thing about a fat separator, if you've never seen one, I can link one below, is the spout is on the bottom. So the fat will rise to the top and I'll be able to pour, and from the bottom, the liquid broth will pour into my jar and the fat will stay on top. So instead of waiting tomorrow when this is completely cooled and the fat is hardened, I want to get this project done tonight. So we're gonna go ahead and do it this way, which is not a big deal, just takes a little bit more time. The dark is the broth and the top is the fat. This is a little bit of fat here. When we go to pour it into our jar, that little bit will go into our jar, but I'm not worried about that. But you can see how we're just pouring the broth from the bottom into our jar and the fat will be left behind. So we're gonna separate that. And I'm gonna pour that into a different jar because that's mostly just the beef fat there. Woo, spilling. I'm just consulting my Presto pressure canner guidebook for the time and amount of pressure I need to do. Anytime you're pressure canning, this is a science. This is not something you can just kind of do whatever you want. You have to follow the directions exactly so you know you have a safe product. So every time I pressure can, I always double check how long I need to pressure can and how much pressure I need to pressure can for. I'm getting the last jars filled up. We want to leave 1 inch of head space. We have 7 jars here, and I'm starting with 7 because that's how many my Presto pressure canner holds. I have white distilled vinegar and a clean paper towel, and I'm wiping the rims. I don't always use vinegar unless there is a little bit of fat. So if I was to can something that didn't have fat in it, I would just use water. But the vinegar helps cut through any fat that might be on the rim. And that, if you leave fat on the rim, can inhibit a good seal. So I'm going through and I'm just really making sure that the rim is super, super clean so that we get a good seal. If we're gonna go through all this effort, we wanna try to do as much as we can so that we get a good product in the end. Now we are going to take a new lid and put a lid on each one. We are leaving 1 inch of head space. And then we take a ring. These don't have to be new, you can reuse your rings. And you're gonna just put them on finger tip tight. That one has a pretty good dent in it. I don't know if you can see that, so I'm not gonna use that one. I wanna make sure there's no dents so you get an even pressure. These are our 7 jars that we're gonna be pressure canning first. Before I added my jars, I added 3 quarts of water. My pressure canner calls for 3 quarts of water, but please, every canner is a little bit different, so read your manual. My canner's manual says I need to pressure can beef broth for 20 minutes at 11 pounds of pressure. My broth was not very warm, and so I put cool tap water in here. You want your jars, the contents of your jars, and your liquids to be at the same temperature. Cold broth in here with really hot water in my canner, I would break my jars. So we want the contents of our canner to be about the same temperature as the water in the canner. Now that we have our jars in here, there we go. And now we're gonna turn the heat on. And this is gonna start to come up to temperature. There's a little vent here. Can you see that vent? This vent is gonna start having steam coming out of it. As soon as we start seeing a constant stream of steam, we're gonna set our timer for 10 minutes and we're gonna let that go for 10 minutes. You see this steady stream of steam? It's been doing this for 10 minutes, and we're gonna put the weight on it. Now that the weight's on it, the pressure is gonna start to creep up to 11 pounds of pressure. When we hit 11 pounds of pressure, we're gonna pressure can this for 20 minutes. So my timer went off. It's been at 11 pounds of pressure for 20 minutes. All right, I turned the stove off, and we are gonna let this come down to 0 pressure naturally. We're not gonna take it off the stove to make it go faster. We're not gonna take the weight off. We're not gonna do anything except turn the stove off and let it come down, back down to 0 pressure so that we can take the lid off, and then we could do one more canning session. I went ahead and changed because it's already almost 8 o'clock and I wanted to get comfortable. But what we're having for dinner, we're eating a little bit late tonight. I made stroganoff with the beef and with the broth, so that is a perfect dinner to make when you're canning beef bone broth. I'm going to be cooking up some noodles here. These are homemade noodles that I made and dried, and they have our homegrown eggs in them. So we're going to have our stroganoff over egg noodles, and then I roasted up some cauliflower. So as soon as this comes down to 0 pressure and we can take the jars out of the canner, I'll show you what that looks like. We are down to 0 pounds of pressure, so we can take our weight off, and this should just open right up nicely for us. It's going to be still very hot. You never want to put your really hot jars on your counter, directly on your counter. That's why I have this dish towel out, because that can crack your jars. Just the temperature difference between the jar and the counter can crack them. What we're gonna do is we are gonna let this pot, this canner, come down, cool down just a little bit more, because this water is still really, really hot, and the next batch that we need to do, these are completely room temperature and they're a little chilled. So if I was to put this directly in here, I could crack a jar, and I don't want to go through this much effort. It's been 2.5 days since we've started this project. Not a lot of actual work, you know, input that I have to do, but the time, I don't want to crack jars if I can help it. Sometimes it happens. You've seen I've cracked jars, but for the most part, I want to try to avoid cracking jars as much as possible. So I'm gonna let this cool down, and then we'll get one more round in here. We got a total of 18 jars. I'm only gonna can 2 rounds, which is gonna be 14 jars. I put some in the fridge, and then we use some, oh, this is the noodles for the stroganoff. We use some for the stroganoff. So we got a lot of broth. This would cost anywhere between $3 and $4, if not $5 or $6 if you bought the really nice. Some of those bone broths though at the grocery store are like $12 a quart, which is just crazy to me. And we made this for basically pennies, because those bones that we got were going to be tossed if I didn't request them when I purchased my half a cow. You can buy beef bones from your grocery store or from your local butcher for a very affordable price. But for me, they basically were for free. A little bit of salt, a little bit of pepper. The carrots were homegrown. The onions I paid a little bit for, but a fraction of the price. I've never put pen to paper on how much this costs, but it's pennies to the dollar of what I would spend at the grocery store. There's no weird ingredients in here. We know exactly what is in here, which is, to me, awesome. And this tastes way better. This is the best quality bone broth you are gonna get anywhere. Is homemade. So, you know, I made a lot of it. This did take me a little bit of time, but now I have 14 quarts that are going to be going in the pantry, shelf stable, not taking up room in my freezer. I used to make bone broth all the time, and I would throw it in my freezer. That works great too, but then you have to remember to thaw it. That is why I started pressure canning, was because I didn't always think through fast enough that I needed to get stuff out of the freezer and thawed. But having it on my pantry shelf, it's just like having store-bought bone broth on your pantry shelf. I will link this pressure canner along with my favorite canning cookbook, the only canning cookbook you'll need, down in the description box, so don't forget to check the description box out. If you enjoyed this canning video and you want to get more into canning and you're new to it, I have quite a few canning videos. I'll put a playlist right here. You can go watch that playlist. I'll also put a video of us hanging out in the garden last year right down here, so if you're interested in hanging out with us in the garden, we'll go spend a day in the garden right there. I hope you guys are having a great day. I want to say thank you for hanging out with me as we made this bone broth. I do need to do one more round, but I'm going to end this video here because it is 8:14 and we are going to be up. I'm going to be up a little bit later. It's probably going to take another hour or so before we're completely done. So I want to say thank you. I hope you guys are having a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.